Daphne Kanes tabled a motion to the court that Tynwald believes the Isle of Man faces an environmental and climate emergency, and government should allocate resources to take urgent and significant action. There were 3 amendments tabled to that motion. One from the Environment Minister, first of all, Geoffrey Boot. He basically wanted it in writing. There will be a climate change bill formulated by December of this year, maintaining the 2050 net zero carbon emissions target. Another amendment from Ralph Peake, essentially a bolt-on, calling for an independent, dedicated climate emergency transformation team to drive change, similar to the sort of concept we saw during the health department debate, I suppose. Your suggested amendment made what some called more radical proposals, that government adopted a more ambitious target of 2035. You also sought a climate impact assessment following a new strategy and action plan. First of all, how did you feel your ideas were received in the House?
I thought generally it went down quite well. I think the biggest area of dissension was only over the pace of change. I think there was a universal acceptance that we had to change, that something had to be done. But what we couldn't agree on in the end of the day was how quickly it should be done. I think internationally it says we need to move very quickly. Other jurisdictions have set very ambitious targets. I mean, some of them were read out in the debate. Jersey as a good example of a 2030 target, another small Irish island jurisdiction that is really going for it, because they acknowledge the need that we need to make these changes, and we need to make them quickly in some ways. And that was really the area that Tynwald members couldn't agree on. It seemed to be almost a split between the ministers in the room and the rest of the House, if I'm going to be honest.
Some members voiced some concerns that maybe your aspirations weren't achievable necessarily, or weren't realistic, particularly in the timescales, as you've mentioned. Do you think their concerns were fair?
I think in some areas possibly. As I outlined during the debate, some of the areas that we're looking at anyway, we've already got a zero target by power station, for example. We're already planning on a 90% reduction in our emissions in power generation by 2035. So to say we're going to go the extra 10% by that same date, that's not a huge extra change. And the same goes for the housing and the transport. Actually, we've already got relatively early dates in the 2040s, I think, for both of those anyway, to get down to a zero emissions. So bringing those forward by a couple of years, again, it's not like we're asking to change the world here. We're just looking to say, can we, instead of getting 70% of the way there, can we get 100% of the way there by that date? So it is definitely achievable. It's definitely doable. It just needs the will, I think, to do it. And I think that's what something is lacking at the moment, is that absolute determination to make sure this happens. And I think I'll be the first person to accept government doesn't always hit its targets. And I think that's another reason for bringing it forward, is if you're aiming for 2035 and you miss it by a couple of years, you're still in a better position than if you'd aimed for 2050, because the reality is we're going to miss the 2050 date. We always miss our targets. That's the way government works. And so if you're setting a very late date, which actually, according to the IPCC, is the very last date you can possibly be setting, and you miss that target, that's just an unacceptable position to be in.
To paraphrase a bit from your contributions in the court yesterday, you said government's actions show the same thinking as before. You've alluded towards a little bit why that was the case just then. Also show a bare minimum approach. Again, you kind of addressed that. You also called the Chief Minister's declaration an exercise in good PR. Why do you feel that?
And again, that's an extension of the same point, really. Is before this was an emergency, we already had an absolute zero target for power generation by 2050. We had a net zero target for housing and for buildings and for transport by 2050. So those are things deal with about 80-85% of our emissions. We already had a zero emissions target for those areas. So then to take a leap forward and say, oh, well, now we're going to go zero emissions completely, it's not quite as big a change as actually they're making it out to be. These targets already exist. They've been in place for a couple of years, and we're just not making enough progress on them. So to run out in front of the crowd, essentially, and say, look, I can see the direction you want me to go in, I'm going to lead you there. Actually, it's a little bit too little too late in some ways. I think the government could easily have been more ambitious. I firmly believe the island can make this kind of change. I think we have the will, I think we have the ability, I think we have the expertise, the skill, and I think we have the determination to get us there. And it's just disappointing that council ministers don't seem to agree with that position.
A point that was raised in discussions, and one which I then put to Daphne Kanes, who proposed the motion. Over the past maybe 3 weeks, we've seen a fairly remarkable shift in opinion from the Chief Minister, and he made that sort of emergency declaration at a media event, not before Tynwald. Again, that was a point raised. Do you feel that sort of change of heart would have come were it not for Mrs. Kane's motion?
It's a difficult question to answer. I think it certainly would have been a factor in his thinking, I'm sure, that to see that there was a motion down in front of Tynwald to actually say, well, let's get ahead of this, let's make that, let's regain control of the narrative, perhaps. I'm not sure is the honest answer. I personally think that perhaps that fed into his thinking. I certainly can't think of any other reason why you would change your mind on something so significant in such a short space of time, especially seeing as the original position was we have to wait for the consultation to finish, and yet it still hadn't finished by the time that the declaration was made. So it all does seem to not stack up, really. So on balance, I'd say quite possibly.